Hi, my name is Sydney, and I failed Camp NaNoWriMo. Yay! Give me a round of applause, everybody. You're welcome. Now, I'm not upset about it because I think at the end of the month, I definitely came up with more positives than negatives. I don't really think there was a whole lot of negatives. I think really it was just a whole huge learning experience, and it was definitely for the better for me as a writer, for me as a person, and for my story as well, my characters within it. So I just thought I would do a little bit of a recap and also tell you about some of the things that I learned this past Camp NaNoWriMo. So let's get into it. So first things first, my goal for Camp NaNoWriMo was to write for 30 hours throughout the entire month. Now it's a 30-day month, April is, so that means basically you can write about an hour a day on average, whether you write 2 hours this day or no hours that day, whatever. Ultimately, I ended up with about 17 hours or 17 or 18 hours, and yeah, it was great. Tim Kim was in my cabin. He wasn't in there like a whole lot, like he really only popped in a couple of times in the beginning. It was really just like me and like 4 or 5 other writers coming in every couple of days. Like there really wasn't a super, you know, conversation going all the time. It was just like every couple of days you would look and maybe nobody said anything, so I might say something, I don't know. But anyway, yeah, so ultimately I wrote 17 hours and most of that came at the end. Like I did a couple of 1-hour sessions in the first couple weeks of the month, and then there was like a week or something where I didn't do anything. There was one weekend where like, okay, I tried to go to Barnes & Noble one weekend, and almost all the way there, my tire pressure signal comes on, like your tire pressure is too low, and it went from like 37 to like 19 or 16 within one day, like just one drive up the highway. So basically that entire day was wasted trying to figure out what was wrong with my tire and everything, and it ended up not working out. The next day I tried to go to Barnes & Noble, same thing happened. And it was just like the writing gods did not want me to go to Barnes & Noble. The universe didn't seem to want me to write those particular days, and I let it happen. I could have written at home, but I had this thing in my mind, and I've kind of had this thing in my mind for a long time, that I can't write at home. Sometimes I get into a mood where I can, and other time, but most of the time I can't. And I'll get a bit more into that later, but I just really basically didn't do a whole lot of writing for the first 3 or so weeks of the month. It wasn't until about a week ago that I actually finally started to do that. I went to Barnes & Noble one day, but I wasn't really feeling it that day. And since then, I've been doing a lot more writing at home. I kind of broke it down one thing at a time. Okay, so like let's start with chapter 1. Boy, chapter 1. I actually spent most of the month that I did do writing working on chapter 1. I think I rewrote it 4 or 5 times. So I have 4 or 5 completely different first chapters. Like there's elements of them that are the same, but for the most part I wrote everything from scratch. Each time that I did a revision, I was pulling a little bit of something else from the previous revision. So it could be like, generally the setting I wanted to be the same. I had the setting in my head that has been the setting for so long, and I love it for so many reasons, and I was trying to make it work, and it wasn't totally working for one reason or another. But I basically kept playing with different perspectives and a couple of different characters and a couple of different things going on, and whatever my main character was doing kept changing in these different revisions. And you have to, it's like just thinking about the beginning. Like part of it was that there's so much pressure on writing at the beginning of a story because, you know, when a reader is looking at the bookstore books or wherever they're looking at their books, you know, they typically are going to go to that first chapter and start reading a couple of sentences and see if they click with the book and if they like what's going on, and that can determine the sale, whether or not, you know, a reader decides to continue on or whatever. So there's a lot of pressure with the first chapter, and I kind of had that in my mind, but I also wasn't too worried about that just yet. Like we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but at the same time it's kind of good to keep that on your radar. I was thinking about what a beginning of a story, what a first chapter is supposed to accomplish. So there's a couple different things. Obviously it has to hook your reader, it has to introduce your world, your characters, your plot. All of that should probably be introduced in the first chapter, and it's supposed to raise a few questions that should be answered later on in the story. So that's kind of a lot to deal with on top of building a world and introducing all that stuff. And this is a fantasy story, so it's about weaving those details in as well in a way that the reader can understand but is also interesting. So there's like so many different things that need to accomplish in this first chapter, and yet the more that I rewrote it, I started to realize that I was making it overcomplicated. I was overcomplicating my first chapter. I was making too many things happen. I was starting too many plot threads when I really just needed to focus, narrow my focus. I needed to narrow my focus on maybe one or two plot threads. You know, raise a couple of questions about my character's past and, you know, some of the things that happened before the story, but also kind of point her in the direction of where she's going to go now. What is her goal? What is she trying? What's the question that she's trying to answer? And how does that reflect in what she's doing in the first chapter? So I had a couple of things. I wanted to foreshadow something that's going to happen a bit later in the story. Actually, it's going to happen relatively close to the beginning. So I wanted to foreshadow that, set that up a little bit. I wanted to hint at or express her past regret and her fears. So I want to talk about regret just for a minute here. So fellow AuthorTube writer Stephen Partridge has a video about like main characters and like regrets and flaws and that kind of thing. And I had always known that flaws were something that a character should have, because you don't want to marry Sue who's like picture perfect and there's nothing wrong with them, because nobody wants to read a story about somebody whose life is perfect and who is perfect themselves. So I always knew about flaws, and my character certainly has her share of flaws, but I never considered like giving your main character a regret. And it was just like this super mind-blowing moment. So like, thank you, Steven. Just figuring out, okay, my main character absolutely would have a regret, and it was glaringly obvious like what that regret would deal with. So I had to think a bit about her backstory and like some of the things that happened. My main character and her mother are on the run. That's how the story starts. They're like sort of on the run. And so they've kind of gotten, so the story starts, they've kind of gotten to this place where they feel a bit settled. And there's a whole reason why they went on the run in the first place. And the reason for that was, it used to be that it had nothing really to do with my, like it had something to do with my main character, but it wasn't so much because of her actions. So it was sort of this thing that happened to her, so that forced them to go on the run. But now I was thinking, okay, if there's a way that I can make it so that something that she did caused them to have to go on the run, then that would be her regret. Like, she did this thing and she regrets it because now it's forced her to be on the run with her mom, and they have not really had much peace or much opportunity to settle or find home in the time that they've been on the run. And so once I kind of had that kernel of something, it made it a lot easier to build my character's motivations and to figure out how she's going to feel in the scenes in the beginning and how she's going to act and what she's going to choose to do. So that definitely was like a candlelight in the darkness. Like, following that gave me like an anchor to figure out where I was going. In all these many revisions, the 4 or 5 different versions of the first chapter I did, I finally got to a first chapter that I was actually really happy with in terms of what it did, and the fact that it accomplished all the things that I thought that this particular story's first chapter should accomplish. So it still needs some work, but it's more like line editing type work. So obviously that's going to come later. And that's the other thing, like, it's been a while since I've really written anything, so I've had to remind myself that it doesn't have to sound great, you know, like that can come later. Yeah, so once I finally got that first chapter cemented, I was able to write it, and I was able to sort of introduce this other plot thread in a way that made a lot more sense than the way it was introduced before. And I finished the first chapter. Like, I actually finished it again, but this time I was actually happy with it. The next day I was like, okay, today I'm gonna write chapter 2, and I did. Then the next day I wrote chapter 3. Right now, today I've been doing my laundry and stuff this afternoon, and in between that I've been working on chapter 4. It's just been this thing of like, okay, taking it one chapter at a time, not looking at the entire scope of the entire novel and all the things that need to be fixed with it, because I have a lot of things that I want to kind of fix with this story, and it's hard, it's kind of overwhelming to look at it all at once. So it's taking it one step at a time, making my goals simple but within reach. This phrase I like to say, out of reach but not out of sight. Like, it's a bit of a challenge, but it's not so big of a challenge that you can't tackle it, you know what I mean? So I feel good. I'm taking it one step at a time. I mean, really, once I got that first chapter done, I knew that was going to be the hardest thing. You know, once I got that first chapter done, I knew it was going to be a bit more smooth sailing. I've had to rewrite the first few chapters because I've changed something, and so now I have to incorporate that into it. But we're moving along, and I'm thinking a little bit ahead in terms of how I want this change to play out in a few chapters, and so that's interesting. But again, one chapter at a time. We're just taking it slow. Sorry, my mom's calling. I definitely learned a couple of things from this endeavor, so that's why I feel like, even though I started the month and went through most of the month with like little to no progress, I feel like I really ended strong. So I feel good about it, and I definitely learned from my mistakes, and I think that as long as I take these lessons to heart, I'll be good moving forward. But of course, that's easier said than done. Lessons learned about my writing process and how to remedy my failure moving forward to become a more productive writer. So again, that's failure in quotes because it's a failure that you learn from, which is kind of like how you're supposed to handle your failures. So they're not really failures, they're like lessons, you know. One thing for sure is learning to become more intentional with my writing time. So every time I go to the Barnes and Noble or a cafe to write, I'm always very intentional about that. Like, okay, I'm going after work, or I'm going on Saturday or whatever, and I'm going to be there probably forever, however long I end up being there, you know, but I'm going there with the intention to write. And I'm always very focused there. There's very few distractions in terms of like, I don't have my TV, I don't have this, that, and the other thing that I could be doing instead. You know, I go there with the intention to write, so my focus is there from the get-go, which is something that I was lacking at home. You know, I have all of my things around, and every time I sit down to write, I kind of just fall into it in terms of like, oh, I guess I should write right now. I have some free time, you know, but I've never been very intentional with my writing time at home, or I haven't been intentional enough. So that's definitely something that's helped me the past few days in writing at home, is being intentional, like setting a goal that's simple. That's another point I have on there, keeping my goals simple within reach. Setting a goal and being like, okay, today I'm going to work on chapter 3, and actually sitting down to work on it. And having an idea of how I want this chapter to turn out and what things I need to fix in it. Yeah, so that all kind of falls together with, you know, being focused is another thing that I learned, just learning to be focused. I didn't do this time, but writing sprints can help. You know, I've done that in the past where I set a writing sprint because that blocks out a certain amount of time where all I have to think about right now is my story. I don't have to think about, you know, my rent, or I don't have to think about this other thing that's bothering me, or I don't have to think about the fact that I have to get up early for work. Like, we're not worrying about that. That comes after the writing sprint. But this writing sprint is like, it's like creating a little writing bubble, you know, for you and your story. And the other thing is that it helps to think about it throughout the day. So like when I go to work in the morning, you know, I might be thinking about my story throughout the day, and then I think, okay, when I get home today, I'm going to work on chapter 3. So that way when I get home, I've already had it in my mind all day. I already know that I'm going to do it, because it's one of those tricks I have to play on myself where, like, if my blanket's done in the dryer. It's kind of one of those tricks I have to play on myself where if there's something that I don't want to do, or something that I'm too lazy to do, for example, doing the laundry, going to the gym, sitting down to write. Like, as much as I love writing, I get kind of really lazy to do it sometimes. So I have to like think about it for a while, and then I suddenly feel like I have the urge to do, like, oh, I should clean my bathroom today or something, you know? Like, if I think about it long enough, it'll feel like it's a new idea when I suddenly get around to doing it. I don't know. But anyway, it works most of the time. But yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at right now. So right now it's May 2nd, and I am gonna keep on with this story. You know, I'm working on chapter 4 right now. Tomorrow I'll work on chapter 5, and hopefully by the end of the weekend I will have finished part 1, which is 6 chapters. Hopefully you guys had a successful Camp NaNoWriMo as well. I think I had a successful Camp NaNoWriMo, if for a different reason. I didn't hit my 30-hour word count, but I think I still did really well, you know? And I learned some things, and my story is further ahead now than it was at the beginning of April, and I think that's what matters. So, thank you guys so much for watching. Give this video a like, hit subscribe, and I will see you next time. Toodaloo.